Hello, and welcome to a special episode of the Dialogue Book Review, where we're actually doing a movie instead. So it's a sort of one-time dialogue movie review, where we're going to be talking about the latest release of Heretic from Studio A24. I'm Taylor Petrey, editor of Dialogue, a journal of Mormon thought, and I'm joined by four fabulous guests tonight. Russell Stevenson has eclectic interests ranging from higher education in Nigeria to race and religion in American history. He holds a PhD in African history from Michigan State University. Evelyn Hornbarger is a 42-year-old mother of 5 children in Texas with a degree from BYU in English literature. She's qualified to speak both literally and figuratively on honor codes and patriarchal grips. She writes heretical poetry, reads nonfiction books, and engages with Facebook as a spiritual practice. Maxine Hanks is a historian and theologian whose works focus on gender and religion and culture, especially feminist theology in Mormon studies and Christian liturgy. And Miranda Soelberg served a full-time mission to Arizona in 2020 and is now studying social work. She's an advocate for improved mental health care in LDS missions, and most recently participated in a Radio West film raising awareness of the prevalence of eating disorders among young sister missionaries. Welcome to all my guests. Okay, everyone's being very quiet. All right. Well,
Thank you.
We're going to go ahead and jump in here with everyone's going to say a few minutes about what they thought about the film. For those who have not seen the film, you should probably just turn this off because we're going to have a lot of spoilers as we have the conversation. Or if you're okay with spoilers, just you're well warned here. But why don't we have Evelyn? Do you want to kick us off with just sort of initial reactions to the film?
All right, initial reactions. I went 2 times. I saw multiple viewings. The first time was with a former Mormon group, and then the second time was with my oldest son and his college friends. Loved. I felt so seen in the movie as a Mormon woman. I loved my representation. I have not seen myself visually represented in such a savvy, clever way in any other film. So I loved it. I appreciated the care that was taken to represent Mormonism in a way that I saw myself. I thought it was creepy at a level that was almost triggering. So that was well done and worth going back again. I commented on Facebook and Maxine saw it, and I think this would make excellent fodder for sort of a Rocky Horror Picture movie with reactions from the audience, including costuming and blueberries and veiled faces. It could just be such a fun repeat watch with lots of audience participation.
That's great. How about Miranda? Do you want to go next?
Yes, sorry about that. I also really loved the movie. There were some things that I felt like within dialogue could have been improved on, but similar to Evelyn, when I saw it for the first time, I felt so seen. It was actually pretty overwhelming for me the first time I went and saw it with some friends who knew that I had served mission, knew kind of my experience on my mission, and then ended up going back the next day to watch it just by myself, just to process. I had a really difficult mission. There were lots of factors that went into that kind of internally and systemically, but to see a mission portrayed in a horror genre was the first time that I've ever seen that, and I did not expect it to be as cathartic as it was. Very impactful for me. It just really physicalized the emotional experience that I had on my mission in obviously like an exaggerated way. I was never locked in a basement with a sociopath, but I did feel trapped a lot of times on my mission. I did feel this idea of like, people told me you can leave at any time, the door is always open, but with influence from my leadership and from my beliefs about going home my mission early, would I ever actually just walk out as if it were nothing? And I loved the questions that it asked about coercive control and really tying in this, really looking at just like gender constructs within religion and tying that into societal rape culture. I thought it did it really, really well. It brought a lot of questions to my mind. I thought the artistic choice to use sister missionaries in the LDS Church was very poignant and very effective, and made those questions just really stand out to me. Yeah, I really enjoyed it.
That's great. That's great. Russ.
Yeah. So, my initial reaction to Heretic, there's a lot going on in it, right? And, you have a few different types of characters. And I must admit that looking at the men of Heretic, the men of Heretic are not exactly admirable people. So I can't say that as a male, I felt seen, and I think that's a good thing, right? I didn't exactly relate to Mr. Reed, or really the weird random missionary who was like cleaning up the chapel in a suit. That was very strange. But I have to say that I found its commentary on kind of the idea of a faith crisis, the idea of faith disorientation, and really commentary on what, the what's and the hows of how people who don't necessarily have the best interests of the faithful at heart go about doing their work. What are the veils that they tend to wear, right? What are the masks that they tend to wear in order to get those who identify as being faithful to buy in, right? How do they pull them into the maze? And I thought that was a pretty insightful commentary. Now, there were a few different points throughout the film where I found it to be a little bit ham-handed. I found it to be a little bit on the nose, and even simplistic of some pretty high-level scholarly conversations. But ultimately, I found that commentary really on this nature of faith crisis, this nature of I'll call it enlightened sadism, to be really interesting and worth talking about.
Excellent. Maxine.
Okay. So I'm kind of the naysayer. There were things I really liked about the film, but overall I kind of didn't like it. So there were a number of things I didn't like. I mean, I'm not a fan of A24 films, other than a few, but A24 films are very dark, cynical, surreal films that are kind of aimed at millennials and boomers, or not boomers, sorry, zoomers, not boomers. And they're really kind of a very cynical kind of treatment that's dark comedy and dark horror, and that tries to, I think, convey a lot of cynicism that younger people feel today. And so I think that kind of format, that A24 kind of film, was the perfect format for the writer's message, because in a way, they're trying to be cynical and satirical about religion, and including Mormonism, but at the same time, they're trying to do something serious. But I thought it was interesting that the writers said, hey, we're members of a cult too. We're members of the A24 cult. Like, that was supposed to make us feel better that, our religion is supposedly a cult. And I thought that was interesting, that they're trying to get at, in this film, they're really trying to deconstruct certainty. They talked about how the one big aim of this film was to really critique certainty and certainty of belief, and truth, and holding a power of belief or truth over other people, subjecting other people to your particular beliefs or truths. So there was a lot of the deconstructive work on belief and truth and certainty that I really liked, that I thought was great. And I think also they're trying to show they're trying to help viewers who are disillusioned and cynical about life, whether they're Mormons going through faith crisis, or people in general disillusioned with religion at this point. They're trying to validate them and help. This film is trying to help people process disillusionment with religion and religious truth and belief and religious certainty. And I think that's all really good. Deconstructive work is really important, to look at our beliefs and look at the hegemony of our beliefs, what is privileged and what is subverted, and how our beliefs and claimed truths used to oppress other people. So all of that is great, I think, about the film. And it goes beyond, Mr. Reed's banal old atheist message. I mean, they're kind of satirizing him too. He's kind of a satirical character. They're really focusing on the sisters' disillusionment and their struggle with belief and faith and loss of innocence. And so that's a more profound message. I think Reed is kind of a construct. But couple more things. The script, I just want to say one thing about the script really quickly. And I know Amanda Hendricks Komodo kind of shared my view on this. The writers felt that Mormonism and sister missionaries in particular were the perfect devices, the perfect characters for what they wanted to explore in terms of deconstructing certainty and one true religion and adherence and belief in that. And so they're using Mormonism and sister missionaries in particularly, as they said, the perfect characters for this kind of deconstruction. Mormonism as the one true religion, and sisters as an example, a device of how religion has power over women and how women have to try to find their own power within religion. And of course, the women in the basement also are used to convey that idea of religion having power over women. But a problem, I have to say, they lost me at the first scene with the sister missionaries sitting on the bench, during their day drafting, getting ready for the next appointment. And they're talking about porn, and they're talking about sex, and they're talking about condom size. I didn't like that for a couple of reasons. As a former sister missionary myself in the 1970s, late 70s, I can say that, yeah, sisters and elders talk about sex and think about sex a lot on a mission because you're kind of in a very controlled environment where you can't date. But at the same time, in the middle of tracting, getting ready for your next appointment, no. And the problem I had with that scene, and a couple of other women said the same thing, that these are the script. This is still a script where women are scripted by men. These are male writers scripting women to play a role for them, for the writers. And so I think this, in that scene, and some of the ways the sisters are used in the film, doesn't escape the very problem that the script is trying to critique of men defining women. And so here are these female characters defined by these male writers who don't really, I think, understand Mormonism that deeply and who don't really know that much about sister missionaries. And I know a lot of former sister missionaries really related to those characters. I didn't at all. I was nothing like those sisters as a sister missionary. Me and my companions would have overpowered Mr. Reed and beat him up. We would never have gone into the basement. I met all kinds of freaky people on my mission, and I felt very empowered in dealing with them. So, but that first scene, I felt that it kind of was not only unreal, but it was kind of sexually exploiting the sisters in a way, as objects, because they're posed as sort of pious versus porn and innocence versus sexual knowledge. And so they're kind of used. I almost felt like it was kind of a script, a rape by script. I don't know. It really bothered me. So I just wanted to mention that. And then I have other ideas I'll save.
Yeah, we're gonna come back to that scene, that opening scene, which is probably the opening and the closing scene are maybe the two most controversial in the film, and we'll spend some time unpacking both of those. For our listeners, again, we're presuming that you've seen this film, that you understand who the character. There aren't very many characters to keep track of, so it's a pretty easy plot to follow. We won't re-summarize it here. But I'm excited that you all have already raised so many of the themes that we want to get into about representation, about what it means to have a Mormon story, issues about gender, issues about horror, that we definitely want to spend some time in our further conversation. I'm going to open it up to discussion and just sort of introduce some of these topics a little bit here. For listeners who aren't watching it and who are just listening it, if I could ask all of the panelists just to say your name at the beginning, who's speaking, so people can kind of keep track of our personalities. Sometimes it's hard to follow the voices in multi-group or in multi-individual conversations like this. But let's turn to that, to our first topic here, which is one that I think occupied a lot of attention in the commentary about the film, both before and after it came out, about, is this an accurate representation? Is this something that, Latter-day Saints have been obsessed with their image, have very much tried to cultivate their image and their public representation. They've been represented in the media for 2 centuries now in ways that have often been very offensive to them. And, this is one more story about Latter-day Saints in which they're the central characters. And so there was a lot of concern about this question. And we've heard already from some of our panelists, maybe some differing perspectives on that in terms of how they related. I'd love to let us dig into that a little bit more. But first of all, let me just ask all of you once again to address this directly. Is this an accurate representation? And does that matter? Why or why not?
I think, when we say accurate, right?
Russ, you gotta introduce.
I got to introduce myself. You can edit that part out. Russell Stevenson. When we say the word accurate, that can mean a couple different things, right? On the one hand, I've heard criticisms that, the conversation about polygamy, for instance, it really didn't represent any of the nuances or any of the core of scholarship regarding Joseph Smith's polygamy. My response to that is, yes, that is true. And by the same token, that's also not something I would expect of 19-year-old missionaries and, random individuals, like Mr. Reed out there in the world, right? I'm quite accustomed to those kinds of caricatures being, floated around, like conversations out on the streets of San Diego, as it were, or, wherever a person may be. That, that's where I serve my mission. They tended to not exactly be paragons of scholarly understanding regarding any subject in church history, or really any subject in the in the study of religious history, for that matter. So did it represent Joseph Smith's polygamy accurately? No, but that's the reality on the ground, right? That's exactly what I would expect out of this kind of exchange and dialogue.
I also completely agree. I had a couple of people ask me when I thought about. Oh, I'm sorry. I see. We're all gonna do this. This is Miranda Soelberg speaking. I thought about 85% of what I saw really resonated. Again, what you were saying of how a sister would respond to these questions of big church history questions, and in that situation where you're kind of under the guise of like, this is a safe place, this is a referral, this person is curious, and so you might not be prepared to be all of a sudden on your guard. And I thought, Sister Barnes, that's like what I would have said when I was 19. I actually found kind of those bigger things that the sisters addressed to be the most accurate. Then there were all the little things like there's an elder pictured without a companion, and we don't really know, like, is he a zone leader? Is he like the board mission leader? Like, I don't know who that is. There were some other little things like that I found a lot of members that I was speaking with who were frustrated really like latched onto. And I think, again, with horror and kind of with this movie, what you were saying, Maxine, about being used as devices to explore a question, I think it wasn't really important, like, who the elder was that came. Like, was he his own leader? The fact was he had authority over the sisters by the nature of how missions go. And like, you know, it was showing like the authority was there, what an elder would have done in that situation was there. Was it accurate? Was it like movies like the Sarah Top Approach where they have like pretty much everything nailed down? No, I don't think they had a recently returned sister missionary on their writing team to go through all of these parts.
I want to address Maxine's commentary on the pornography conversation on the
This is
bench.
Evelyn.
This is Evelyn. Hi. This is Evelyn. I felt like, I don't know who you were, Maxine, as a young missionary, but I would absolutely have had that conversation. And it sort of would have been a gatekeeping sort of conversation to feel out my companion. How far can I go? How much can I talk about that? It's like, I'm going to say pornography and say I watched it. Like, how did she react to that? And she did have, we find out later, she had that birth control in her arm, but she doesn't divulge that to her companion. So they were just trying to test each other out and seeing how much they could trust each other. And then her explanation of she saw this girl having sex and then it taught her that the church was true. I absolutely would have come to that same conclusion that she, the light had gone from her eyes and I just knew the church was true. I would have had that conversation. So I didn't feel used in that. I felt it was so funny to me. I was laughing, giggling my little Mormon giggles at how clever the whole thing was with that Trojan condom picture on the bench. And I thought they nailed it.
I also want to go off of that, of like those conversations that are so awkward, and like the like mispronunciation of words where she was like pornography, and like, you know, all these things were very like satirical. I don't know of any sister who didn't know how to say the word pornography. But I also want to go back to like using what is this opening thing for? Like, why did we open this way? And I think it opened up into a lot of themes while providing this like really, really like bold, satirical, really funny way of introducing these characters. Whether or not I think I was kind of in between the two of Maxine and Evelyn. I think I would have been too terrified to bring it up with any companion, but I know that you're also like, you could tell Sister Barnes was a safe place for Sister Paxton in that conversation, where Sister Paxton was kind of opening up about these things that obviously she had questions about, she didn't fully understand, like saying things like, you could watch the soul leave her, like wash away from her eyes. Like, it's just very campy, which is how a lot of my companions were and how I probably was. So there were moments of that I really did enjoy and felt really seen. But I also agree it was pretty exaggerated.
It was exaggerated. This is Evelyn again. And the other thing it shows is just their naivete as they go into this world, and it's a horror movie. Like, they don't know anything. So it sets the tone for how dangerous this world is to them and kind of what they're walking into, and the innocence that they have walking into the world that is going to be super scary.
I thought that this is Taylor. I thought that in a way, you know, I think the right question is, well, what is this setting up? Like, what are the themes that we're supposed to be getting from this? And in a way, I thought that it was, in some respects, to both introduce their naivete and that they're not really either, you know, that there's a sort of surface level to that, or that there's a deeper piece of all of this, that they have watched pornography, that they have, you know, that they think about condom sizes, that they, you know, that these are real people in a way. And again, it's an artificial way to kind of to do that. It's probably not the most common conversation that you would expect, right? But it is setting up sort of both layers of their personalities in for me at least, as apparently naive but not really. And it's that not really that is really the kind of heroic arc of both of their stories, that they're not as dumb as you think they are. They're not as naive as you think they are, right? And in a way, the kind of like pornography discussion was some way of sort of cluing us into that, maybe, for me, at least for me.
And, you know, trying to piggyback off that, Russell Stevenson here, you know, the world of a missionary it's a strange world, right? By comparison to other experiences, you know, in day-to-day life. You know, it's in terms of one's network, it's a pretty closed system. You're talking to literally the same person all day, every day for a duration of, you know, often several months. And, you know, you are also at the same time supposed to be navigating a world that it is commonly understood is deeply opposed to this closed network in which you live, right? So, you know, you develop this this kind of insider logic, you know, this jargon, you know, these, you know, this kind of repertoire of, you know, this canon of strange experiences. And at the same time, looking out there in the world, it's a mixture of often kind of revulsion, but also curiosity, right? You're feeling at once, okay, out there in the world, you know, Babylon, as we often call it, okay, it's filled with all kinds of horrible and strange and dark things. And yet at the same time, you're so far removed from them. You're in this enclosed network, and, you know, you don't really have the opportunity to have serious conversations about sexuality with your peers. And even if you wanted to, you know, the fact that you are in the position of being a missionary, it automatically throws up filters, barriers, walls. So in that way, it does a pretty effective job of that. Now, at the same time, I'm strongly sympathetic to Maxine's comment about it being, you know, exploitative, you know, of Latter-day Saint naivete, right? That, you know, this naivete, as we call it, I mean, that has a pretty strongly negative connotation. Like, very rarely would you say somebody's naive as a compliment, right? And I would say it's pretty hard won, right? Our history, you know, for all of its ups and downs, and for better and for worse, you know, it has created a kind of insular community, and that came at a pretty profound price. And, you know, now you can see some of the after effects of this on screen as a way to introduce a blockbuster movie, right? So, you know, say what you will about it, but I'm pretty sympathetic to this idea. It's okay, so, you know, I get the experience they're talking about. I get the kind of insider outsider dynamic that they're establishing. But at the same time, it's like, hey, that in and of itself is really part of our complexity, right? That is part of our cultural character.
Let's turn to the other topic that Maxine raised, and it's one that many of us have sort of been flirting around a little bit about, the gendered representations here. And, you know, Maxine has had this really important argument with others that there is a kind of ventriloquism of female characters that we want to be attentive to. And but I also want us to think about the gender of Mr. Reed as well as another piece of this. One of the great commentaries that I read from a non-Mormon reader or a viewer of the show was that the horror was of mansplaining, what it's like to be mansplained to for for hours at a time. And you know, so there is that like long lecture thing of like every woman knows what it's like to be talked at, you know. And so I want us to be thinking about kind of all of those themes, but there are a lot of really interesting, there's a sort of straightforward story, and then there may be some subversive elements to what's going on with gender here. I'm curious to get other people's thoughts about how to interpret this story.
I can just jump in. This is Maxine. I should follow up that my point about sisters talking about porn and condoms. I was talking about that when and where it was happening. Missionaries talk about sex a lot, but it was the way that the film exploited that moment, you know, to to have them doing it right then as they're getting ready to go see an investigator, I thought was weird. But yeah, the gender issue in the film is, of course, they're using women as the device to kind of deconstruct how power is used, particularly if the one true religion is control, as the film suggests, which is Mr. Reed's theory. That's his answer to the one true religion is control, and particularly male control over women. The film is, the writers are trying to deconstruct that. They're using the sisters, the female characters, to show that that's not always true. Yes, there are these women in the basement who are imprisoned, and there are women who are controlled and imprisoned by religion. But the sisters are used as a device to show women finding their empowerment and finding their own sense of self in the midst of being controlled to a degree that they have no way out. How do you still find your own power as a woman in this system, which is designed to completely destroy you? How do you find your own power? And so the film is exploring that and using sisters to do that. And it's interesting the way the film is using women in three ways. The image of the blueberry pie as the mother who is in the kitchen baking, but we never see her. She never appears. She's invisible. So it's the promise, the illusion of a woman who's a homemaker, who's busy in the kitchen baking a pie. So there's that image that the film is trying to say is a false image. It's a false construct. And it beautifully accesses the mother in heaven theme in LDS theology. We have the promise of the mother. She's there in heaven. She's there in the home baking the pie. But we can't see her. She's invisible. She never appears in this house church, of Mr. Reed's house, which symbolizes the church. And then we have the sisters who are deconstructive elements, and then the women in the basement who are overpowered. So we have three different treatments of women as women finding their power, women who totally lose their power, and women who are destroyed, and women who are completely invisible.
I'd like to jump in on that, Maxine. This is Miranda again. I can't even explain. Like, Maxine wrote this on her Facebook wall, and this was so eye-opening to me, even having seen the movie twice, of the idea of the mother, and even how that's kind of a predator that's used to bring women in and for women to say, well, we do have a place, whereas it's so hard. It's not there. It's non-existent. It's not set into words. And also I want to kind of tie in our other theme to this one about gender, about the very first thing that we learn about these sisters is this scene that is very exploitive. And we're talking about pornography, and we're really looking into an intimate moment of where they're being vulnerable with each other, and we're kind of like stealing in and watching something that really isn't meant to be shared. And I think that sets us up for what the rest of the movie tells us, and it explains who Mr. Reed is. I think that's exactly what Mr. Reed does. The beginning of the movie almost looks like it's what Mr. Reed imagines what they're talking about before they come to his house. It's like, this is who he views them as. And I believe that, like, kind of the theme of the whole movie in general is gender violence, is sexual violence, and kind of tying that in together with patriarchal structures. And so when we look at it that way, when we see it set up in this exploitive way where Mr. Reed is looking at them, he's having a predatory sexual experience the whole time. And he is looking at these women as something to be controlled intellectually, spiritually, and then eventually physically. And to see, like, when you look at the violence that is prevalent in the movie from this gendered, like, sexual assault, rape culture, it is so clear to see, like, he murders Sister Barnes very abruptly, very suddenly, as soon as she does not fit into this fantasy anymore. As soon as he realizes that he can't watch her crumble under him, and he kills her. It's so abrupt when you're watching the movie. I was shocked the first time when it happened. And then he pivots and he uses it to keep Sister Paxton in. And he presents himself as this this supernatural, I know what you're thinking, I know I'm inside your head, there's nothing you can do, and the only way out is through, and it's through this thing that I've constructed. And in the end, he's just a very fancy rapist with a very like well-constructed house that serves his own fantasies. And the real horror is not the religion, it's not dogma, it's not doctrine, it is this predator. And so, I mean, we talk about like the real horror is mansplaining, but what does that tell us about what mansplaining is? Is that like, are we like making light of something that is really like used to control women in an intellectual way? Are we really like, are we looking at these things lightly and only addressing rape culture once we see women in cages, and once he says, this is your life, here's where your soul melts out of your eyes and you realize that you have no choices anymore? And I thought the gender tension, the like bringing in, why was Sister Paxton somebody who was so vulnerable to this? What in her life, in her view of gender structures, in her view of how to, what self-autonomy is, how does that set her up to be in this predatory situation? And then what about Sister Barnes's influence eventually gets her to be able to step into this self-actualization and to say, I will follow my own path. It may be a circle, but I'm going to claw my way out of here because that's what I've decided to do, and not what he told me I could do by keep walking.
Miranda, I love that. Well, okay, this is Evelyn again, talking to Miranda. So good. Okay, the other thing that I think is the horror of the movie is patriarchy. I think patriarchy is the horror of everything. So, not hard to put it on Heretic, but the thing that happens with Mr. Reed is he is playing into patriarchy so well, and it makes a monster of him as he looks for control over these women. So obviously it's bad for the women. They end up in cages. But I feel patriarchy takes away the emotional maturity and nurturing of a man, and he's kind of giving them like a worthiness interview in this lounge area in his house, and they have to go through him in order to get out. And that's how I felt talking to bishops and stake presidents, is they were this person keeping me from the next step, and they were the one that gave me permission. And one of the sisters played the game very well, and one of them was murdered quickly, as Miranda pointed out, when she no longer fit in. The survival to work with patriarchy was the charming, thank you for your mentorship, as she walks down into the basement, and just charming this man. And she's the one who survives longer within the system that he's running. And he's just a classic cult leader in the end. He's just like every other douchey guy who ever ran a cult, and keeps women in cages in the basement and cuts their fingers off. So icky. But that is a horror to me, is the way that patriarchy strips men of their ability to connect authentically with women, men, anyone, and creates this power structure where you have to go through them in order to get to the next thing.
Yeah. I think this commentary on kind of the nature of Mr. Reed's villainy is, it's really interesting because I've seen some discourse. I can't say it's the majority, but there's some discourse that implies an underlying sympathy for Mr. Reed, because the kinds of things he says, the kinds of arguments he makes, they happen to align with one's own, right? They happen to align with, perhaps a less than well thought out iteration of atheism, right? A less than well developed view of biblical criticism. And, many people, have not deeply thought about it, but it aligns with that. And because of that, They start seeing Mr. Reed as a problematic, maybe rough around the edges representation of something other than what he is, which is ultimately a sexual predator with a robust vocabulary and a high degree of charm. And speaking about my own mission experience, I mean, we all knew somebody, well, whether they were a sexual predator or not, they were definitely predatory, and they had a robust vocabulary, and they were very adept at identifying missionaries' weaknesses and pulling them into their maze. And 3 hours later, the missionaries, they don't know what up from down. And at the end of the day, this person, ultimately they are looking at, they do believe that the one true religion is control. And in that way, you could say Mr. Reed is really a good and proper Foucaultian, except he came to think that the panopticon was a very good idea, rather than the great atrocity of our times.
One more quick thought, just really quick, I forgot to mention. This is Maxine again. I was at first concerned that the women in the film were portraying the typical binary of women in religion. You're either disempowered and conforming and surrendering as a victim, or you're a rebel. You resist the religion. And so that third option of being an agent and finding your own agency to really renegotiate and recreate your role and space within religion, I was worried that just wasn't there. But I decided after seeing it the second time and thinking about it that actually Paxton does model to some degree that third option of agency. You have the women who are destroyed and disempowered in the basement, and then you have Barnes, who is the rebel from the start all the way through. She's the rebel. She's resisting. But I think Paxton is exploring that third option of agency.
There are so many, there's not one gendered message here, as many of you have pointed out, right? That we have characters kind of engaging all kinds of things. We have the first prophet who dies, who kills herself, right? We have the second prophet who subverts his authority by saying it's not real, right? We have the various ways in which the two missionaries are kind of trying to survive this by placating, by resisting. And as many of us have noted here, the religion that they're opposing is actually a kind of atheistic perspective, ultimately, right? And so, like, the way that that religion is gendered as female and is actually the thing that is both the thing that disempowers them and the very thing that saves them too, is another kind of interesting layer to all of it. So there's a kind of like not a single simplistic message, and I think that's one of the reasons why people have been so attracted to this is to kind of pull apart all of these different themes. So let's turn a little bit. I want to talk about atheism a little bit more, and whether there is how the film engages that. But before we get to that, some of you have raised this question of horror already, and it's the film is also subverting the traditional genre of religious horror in a funny way. Typically, Catholic horror, religious horror, is based on the supernatural, and this is a film which denies the supernatural very, very explicitly as the basis for horror. We have that part of his speech, part of Mr. Reed's speech, is that it's horror either way, whether belief or non-belief, it's horror one way or the other, right? And we don't get the kind of ghouls and goblins and demons and stuff like that sort of that is traditional in religious horror. But the atheism is the horror, right? So I'm curious to have some reflections on that theme of why horror is the genre here, and also just some maybe commentary on the gore and some of the visual images here of whether, if I don't know if any of you are horror fans. I'm not, so I won't speak directly to it, but any thoughts or commentary on that element of it too?
Russell here, he's turning Kierkegaard on his head. in a way, right? I mean, Kierkegaard spoke about faith as being, crucified on the cross of the absurd. And I mean, you leap to faith, you're a knight of faith. This was the nature of the faith journey, and it ought not necessarily be feared, right? It's something that really should be embraced. And you could say, obviously, even Kierkegaard himself acknowledged, okay, it takes a real leap to get to this point, right? You really need to extend yourself. So in this way, Mr. Reed is pointing out the obvious. That taking this leap to faith, that daring to be crucified on the cross of the absurd is a horrifying experience. But by the same token, maintaining and, acknowledging, okay, well, there is no cross. There's nothing to be crucified over. This leap is, it is in many ways inevitable. And yet, at the same time, it will lead to your demise, as for all these, all these other people. That too is horrifying. So, as you say, Taylor, it's as Mr. Reed articulates, it is horror either way, and I mean that in itself is very subversive of how we've conventionally seen depictions of religion in film.
Okay, the horror was the loss of faith. How autobiographical can I get on this podcast? Should we keep it? Well, anyway, so last Christmas I was invited to sing in my ward, and by a friend, and I've had my records removed, so my former bishop said I couldn't sing on Christmas Eve in my ward. So it was the worst Christmas story I've ever heard. I felt so judged, loss of community, loss of faith. Christmas was dead. God was dead. Everything was horrible. And I literally sat in bed Christmas morning and just said, tell me when it's over. I had my kids open their presents on their own, and it was just, and I feel the nihilism that was captured in this, with both doors leading to the same thing, whether you have faith, disbelief, or belief leading to the same thing, and the loss of hope and loss of certainty and loss of God, that was unique to horror, and it felt completely accurate that there is no God here. All there is control, and it's the worst. So I think they did a good job.
Evelyn, I want to go back on that as well. Thanks for sharing, because I completely agree. I think the nihilism was really interesting. I am a huge horror fan. I think movies are poetry. I think horror generally has a lot of, I'm so sorry, there's like a really loud plane. I don't know if you can hear it, but I think movies are poetry, and I think like the horror genre specifically for me uses so much imagery that it's just like one of my favorite genres to pose questions in, specifically like the psychological horror, but even like Alien or Get Out or Jacob's Ladder kind of all uses this. But I was really shocked when I went and saw the movie, and thinking it was going to be like an R-rated horror movie like I've seen before. It did not, as a horror fan, it did not check very many boxes of an R-rated horror movie. But I went with my friend, and she was like, the nihilism, the like kind of horror of the void that they really captured was very poignant and as somebody who's gone through a face transition, I'm like, oh, the void, you're scared, it's okay, you'll work through it, like don't worry about it. But I'm like, but yeah, I thought that was such an interesting take of like, there was gore, yes, and I keep telling people when I tell them about my review, they're like, should I go see it? And I'm like, it is an R-rated horror movie, like, but let's not be distracted. But I do think that the really poignant thing that they were able to do was to capture the like nihilism in like congruency with this like horror of the sisters being like, oh, this is a very unsafe situation with a very unstable individual, and I am not safe, and there's nowhere to get out. And the two sisters kind of come to the same conclusion, but two different ways. Like one is fawning, one is trying to get out safely, one is like doing what I think most of us would do of like say what they want to say so that we can get out of here. And then the other one is kind of being the rebel. And neither of them think like, this man could absolutely murder us, and if he's going to do so, he will do so in this front room. I am not walking down the stairs. They didn't ever come to that conclusion, which was one of the most horrifying parts for me too, was like, you're looking at that basement, there is no door. I'm so sorry, there's no door. It does not matter.
Well, that's one of the maybe traditional horror elements that I think it got, is like, why are you going in there? Like, you as a viewer, you're always like, don't
Never go in the basement.
Yeah. And of course the gender of horror films too, of the kind of scary male versus the innocent young woman, the gore of the slasher film, and in some respects sort of there's an homage to that part of it as well. So there are some elements of horror that are there as well. Maxine, did you have a comment on this one too?
Yeah, to answer your question about atheism and horror, the film is mocking atheism. Mr. Reed is a throwback. You know, his apartment, his house, his clothes, it's like 1970s. He's outmoded, he's passé. And his atheist critiques of religion, the film is trying to say, this is old, dry stuff. The film is trying to move beyond that and take you to existentialism as a better alternative to atheism, as something beyond atheism, which is interesting because I went through that process myself in the early 80s. Loss of faith, loss of God, fell into the atheist void. And my salvation was existentialism, that reading the existentialist philosophers while working at BYU to discover that we make our meaning, we find our meaning. There is meaning in life, but it's subjective and personal, and we have to find it. So it's the existentialist view. And so the film is offering existentialism really as a better alternative, and using the sisters to get to that point that we'll talk about at the end. Horror. The way that it worked in terms of horror, and it's typical A24, although not as bloody as most A24 films. But for me, the power of the horror of that film, and this is one of the things I liked and I think it got right, was the horror of female annihilation. How it feels to be a woman in a male-dominated system that erases you, that programs you, that holds out promises that never materialize, that disempowers you, that destroys your sense of self or prevents you from ever having a sense of self develop. I mean, the horror of female annihilation and loss of self is powerful in the film. It's one of the most powerful, I think it's one of the most powerful messages the film was trying to say. And it does get Mormonism right, and it does get religion right in that shadow side of it, the side of religion that annihilates women and their sense of self and their potential and their lives. And that's horrific. And I felt it, even though I personally feel like I've evolved far beyond that place, I still felt it profoundly in the film.
Well, let's talk about its portrayal of religion, faith, atheism. There is a way in which we are not meant to identify with Mr. Reed, even though, as Russ mentioned, many people sort of take for granted this kind of the atheistic perspective, right? Both of you mentioned sort of existentialism, existentialist philosophers as a kind of background in influencing this. What are we to take as the message about religion and atheism from this film? And let me pose one specific way of asking it too, because I'm curious to get your thoughts on this. Why does Mr. Reed's plot fail in this case? It's evident that it has worked many times before. He's got his little notepad where he's writing down what time he does this, right? He's studying them, right? And is it, are we to infer that this is all sister missionaries that have fallen into his cages there in the basement? Are these other women who have fallen? I'm curious about that specific question too. Like, what is it about this time that made it different, and whether there's some commentary about religion, faith, atheism? They're just, again, big, broad set of questions, but thoughts or commentary?
That's an interesting question, and it actually brings to mind a much older film at this point, The Truman Show. The Truman Show is the story about a fellow named Truman, who's basically raised in this concocted television world made by this godlike creator named Christoph, and he is organizing it as a TV show all the way from Truman's birth all the way up through his eventual escape from this constructed world. And while it isn't bloody, you don't see anyone have their throats get slit. It is horrifying in its way, because eventually you begin to see that there are little tells. It's a little bit like the movie Inception, and that there are moments where he begins to see things are not as they ought to be, and somewhat akin to when the prophet tells the sister missionaries it's not real. Right. There were these little tells, and eventually Truman orchestrates his escape. It's a little bit like a Plato's cave allegory in that way. So, harkening back to this, this theme about existentialism, the only way that Truman was ultimately able to escape was by embarking on a journey that nobody else could do. Right. That nobody else could go along with him. And, eventually he comes up against a literal wall, which was supposed to be the sky, right? It was painted to look as though it were the sky, but actually it's a wall. The ship runs up against it. And, Christoph is trying to convince him to stay within this world. It's dangerous out there. It's unsafe. And eventually he escapes. So similarly in this, in this film, and to be honest, I think it was a bit oddly done. Here you have Sister Paxton, who, she has definitely given off the, at least the vibe of orthodoxy. But then at the end, she ends up tipping her hand, and she says, well, actually, I don't think prayer really works. And in this moment, you see that, well, actually, it looks like she's been going on her own faith journey. And that secretly, I would argue that the title Heretic is actually referring to her, because even though she gives off the vibe of orthodoxy, ultimately she's much more heterodox than we've ever supposed. And eventually she too, like Truman, is able to escape from this contrived world that doesn't represent reality in any way. And that is her journey, just as Truman's journey was to the outer reaches of his world.
Yeah, I love that. Can I jump in next? This is Maxine. Yeah. Yeah, there are 4 heretics in the film. And I think the reason why these women survive, and in their own way, they don't totally survive, but they take a different path than the other women in the basement, is because they're heretics. And it's their heresy that enables them, again, to find agency and do something a little different. Heresy gives you agency outside of that constriction of orthodoxy. And it's interesting because, again, I have to mention the blueberry. The most prominent symbol in the film is the blueberry pie, and which symbolizes both, I think, the false construct, the facade, the image of femaleness and motherhood and stereotypic roles, but it also evokes the Bluebeard myth of the man who gets wives and keeps them in a locked room and kills them one at a time. And I don't know how intentional it was, but it perfectly portrays the Bluebeard myth. And there's a connection with the dark side of Mormon polygamy there that is suggested. That there are all these, if it's the Bluebeard myth, then also the polygamy theme comes in as these women, these wives who are lured one by one into this dark subconscious realm the basement representing the subconscious self, the subconscious side of Mr. Reed, the subconscious side of the church, the shadow, the buried, avoided, hidden side. And so you have the, you know, that image of the dark side of polygamy there as well. But the heretics, you start out with the obvious heretic of Mr. Reed, whose name also evokes reading, to read a text differently, and Mr. Red, you know, the patriarchal conservative guy. But he's the first heretic, the obvious one, but the sisters are the other two heretics, who each in their own way are resisting and re-navigating religion. But the fourth heretic, and this gets to the point I'm trying to answer, I'm not sure if the film's writers got this or not. I'm still unclear. But the fourth heretic is Mormonism. It's a heretic Christianity. It's not Protestantism. It's not Orthodoxy. It's an esoteric heretic Christianity. It's kind of this heretical, mystical, visionary tradition that doesn't fall into easy categories. And so where the film goes, and I'll leave most of this for our discussion of the end, but where the film goes is that question of, is the ultimate truth existentialism? Just that there is no a priori knowing. We are all prisoner in the symbolic realm of language and symbol. I mean, the house is also the symbolic realm in which we all live, and truth is always reformulated and ever reformulating, but there is no a priori truth or knowledge or access to knowing beyond the symbolic constructed realm. Knowledge is constructed. So that's the prison, you know. And so the film is taking us through that and telling us that the best we can get, the ultimate truth isn't power, and it's not power over women. The ultimate truth is the relativity of knowing that the only thing you can really count on is that you have to come up with your own interpretation and your own meaning, that it's all relative. But is the film ever at the end, and I'll wait until we discuss the end, but is it going beyond that at all? Is it getting at the heresy of Mormonism, which, like mysticism, Mormonism is a mystic Christianity that suggests you can have glimpses beyond the constructed realm, beyond, there is access to a priori knowing, if only in glimpses. There's something beyond constructed knowledge in the symbolic realm.
Well, let's move to the end and do a discussion there as a way of kind of getting a handle on this question about the film's commentary on faith, religion. I love this idea that it is not religion or atheism per se, but heresy as the path of salvation, as the path of self-actualization, is a great way of looking at it. Russ has raised the scene about prayer, which I think is one place to talk a little bit about, where again, our most sweet naive person reveals herself to not actually believe in prayer, and yet prays in that moment, right? Does her prayer work, or does her prayer fail? And it is the actions then of Sister Paxton that save her in spite of herself. She could have pushed him off. She could have done, and somebody had to come and save her because she was praying. So what is this saying about prayer? And then maybe the butterfly scene at the end as another place of like, what's the message? I think that's it had a controversial cliffhanging ending, and what does it mean? And so I'm curious to maybe get everybody's commentary on those two aspects as we wrap things up here.
I think this ending scene of Sister Paxton's prayer was some of the most poignant symbolism that was there. So when Sister Paxton, Mr. Reed has just committed like the ultimate act of control of taking her life, or attempting to. And, she's kind of there, and they're in this kind of like awkward what do we say? Neither of us is dead yet, kind of situation. And she doesn't say she doesn't believe that prayer works. She says that there is a study that scientifically proves that it doesn't work. And she says, but I think it's really beautiful to think about other people, even if that other person is you. And she prays. She starts thanking God for her life, for her family, for everything that she has. Very simple, beautiful prayer. And she's kind of holding her hands clasped, very much like a child. And Mr. Reed crawls over and inserts himself into this moment that she's having with her own spirituality and puts himself like Christ on the Madonna, literally on her chest, the dying crucified man, the center of his own religion. And she is this perfect virgin mother. She's innocent, but is she really? She is this kind of pinnacle of this fantasy that he has. And he puts himself there like a real jerk. I was so mad with that. I was like, is there no peace for this woman? And it's Sister Barnes, who is the resurrected savior, who literally crushes the head of this false Christ with nails and wood, which I thought was a little bit heavy-handed, as we've spoken. I was like, okay, we can get, it's fine. But Sister Barnes, the one who taught Sister Paxton what it meant to fight back and fight back intellectually, to hold space for, I don't think that that's true. And so what do I really think? And that's her whole journey. And I just loved that Sister Barnes was the one who came as this resurrected savior to fulfill this question of what is the true religion, and is the true religion control, or is the true religion and our true salvation something that we decide, and this mystical experience. And then Sister Paxton, still wounded, still unsure what her future is going to be, claws to the light and to further light and knowledge, and literally reclaims her own salvation and says, I get to decide now, not this man who was putting me exactly where he wanted me, not anybody else, not even Sister Barnes can do it for her, even though she kind of she saves her. But in doing this, witnessing Sister Barnes' sacrifice, realizing that autonomy is still possible, she becomes a Magdalene figure and kind of transforms from this Madonna that he had into a witness of her own religion, and goes out into this light and this mystical experience. For me, that's what I know. We talked about how this movie was very, very sad. I actually thought of it as a reclamation of curiosity, a reclamation of I get to decide. I get to decide how I navigate this void, this existentialism, this nihilism. I get to decide if I have hope, if I make that effort to find the spirituality and to find the meaning and the purpose. As for the butterfly, I thought, kind of going with that, it's unclear if the butterfly is the one that followed her from the house that we saw really, really early in the beginning, or if it's a figment of her imagination, or if it's a spiritual experience that isn't actually real. But does it have to be real? Does the butterfly physically have to be there for her to feel Sister Barnes's presence, which is who I believe the butterfly represents? So I loved the ending. I thought it was really interesting. I thought it's when everything kind of tied together. You can see me getting really passionate. So I'm excited to see what you guys think too.
Okay, I'll talk. Miranda. Thank you. Amen, Miranda, once again. This is Evelyn speaking up. I thought the ending with the sister saving the other sister was the one true religion is the power of sisters to save each other. And the miracle of that whole movie was her resurrection and her saving that sister because she loved her. No greater love hath any sister than the one who bangs brother Reed on the head, Mr. Reed on the head, and killed him. I don't know if she gets out. She may have died in there, and she may, that may have been just a vision. I like to think she got out, though. In my way, she got out, but her cell didn't have service, and she was outside, so that's very disturbing. But I like to think that she got out anyway. So in my mind, she did. And I think the butterfly was Mr. Burns coming to visit her, because that was her little, I'm going to put it right on the finger. It was pretty on the nose. So to me, that was it. And love saved the day.
I'll chime in now. Russell here. I thought like the act of her breaking out on its own was pretty powerful, because it highlights for you. I mean, for most of the movie, for a good chunk of the movie, I mean, you've really been pulled into this maze, and when you're in the maze long enough, it's really easy to start accepting the maze as capital R reality, right? It is the way things are. And the moment she breaks out, it is a visual and powerful kind of tap on the glass saying, everything that you've just seen, it's an artifice. And Mr. Reed has tried his level best to convince them this is reality and that this is where they are, and he has full control over them, and they have no other avenue. And the moment she breaks out emphasizes that this panoptic type structure that he's trying to develop, it's false. It isn't real. In case, we had ever come to start buying into Mr. Reed's rhetoric, which I think we were intended to. I mean, it resonates with at least some portions of the population. It feels very enlightened. It feels very forward-thinking. It feels like, the kinds of things that smart people take as a given. But she breaks out of the structure that is housing those things. And, we can discuss, okay, did she die in there? Who is the butterfly? But for me, the most powerful message is she broke out. One way or the other, the world that Mr. Reed had constructed was, call it a great and spacious building, if you will.
Well, again, one of the fascinating pieces that I'm still wrestling with here too, around the prayer and the ending scene, is the space for miracle that the film leaves. Right? It is not actually just her agency that saves her. She is not on her own, making her own path and saving herself. It is actually a miracle that saves her. It is actually that her companion comes back to life and rescues her in her moment of despair, when she has nothing else to do but pray, and is not praying for that specific miracle, and yet a miracle occurs for her in spite of herself. There's a sort of grace to it, right? And in a way, it's that miracle that is the most optimistic part of the film for me. And I'm also still not entirely sure what to do with the ending. Does she die, or is she alive, or is this an illusion for herself too? But I love the kind of ambiguity of all of these symbols, not as a kind of incoherence to the film, but precisely as the place where an artistic expression that raises so many of these great questions. I have really, really enjoyed this discussion and learned a lot about the film from all of you. Any just final thoughts as we wrap up here that anybody didn't get to say that they wanted to mention?
Sure, I'll just chime in on your last question about the ending. This is Maxine. And I felt that I was a little frustrated with the miracle, because again, it was like surreal horror, A24 style, which in a way almost mocks spirituality and miracles. And but I felt that the film was trying to take us to that paradox at the end of existentialism versus mysticism. And it's offering both options. Is this all just a matter of perception? Is the end all about Paxton's perceptions, which is kind of where it's leaving you. because she's the last living person. So it's about her perceptions. But it's sort of, on one hand, it's sort of saying, well, you can't really know. You can't really know anything. Everything is perception. And we're leaving you at the end with that message that we don't really know if she was alive or dead, or if it was all her perceptions, or if there was something transcendent going on, beyond, something metaphysical, something spiritual. And so I was disappointed because I wanted the film to give a little better option, a little more option for the mystical to be there. Rather than just leaving you with the question, we don't really know. And so as a mystic myself, I wanted to say, well, I wanted something in there that says she really did know something, she really did access something spiritual. But I think the film leaves us with that question, that paradox.
Well, thank you all once again for this really rich conversation. I hope that that other people have enjoyed it and have learned something from it as well. There are many more things to say about this, and I hope that for a long time we'll still be thinking about and with this film as a really beautiful contribution, not only to broader culture, but specifically, I think, to Mormon culture and Mormon representation in film. And I hope that we see more smart films like this in the future. Evelyn, Miranda, Maxine, and Russ, thank you all again for your time. And let me just finally say that if you enjoyed this episode as a listener, please share it with your friends and colleagues. And don't forget to leave us a review or get in touch with any comments or questions. We hope that you'll tune in to future episodes of the podcast. And please subscribe and rate the show. Be sure to check out the whole range of shows in the Dialogue Podcast Network. Good night.
Greetings. My name is Rebecca DeSchweinitz, and I'm thrilled to serve as a board member at the Dialogue Foundation and as one of the hosts of Dialogue Gospel Study. In each episode, which we record live the second and fourth Sunday of every month, we welcome esteemed speakers from a variety of backgrounds to share their insights and perspectives on the Come Follow Me lessons. Our aim is to spark meaningful conversations about the scriptures, to connect them to our personal experiences and to our understandings and explorations of the gospel. To stay in the loop with our upcoming lessons and this opportunity to engage with Mormon thought, culture, and belief, be sure to visit dialoguejournal.com and sign up for our newsletter. By doing so, you'll receive updates and timely links to join our live stream lessons. Additionally, you can catch up on our past guests and episodes by subscribing to Dialogue Journal on YouTube, Facebook, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Dialogue Podcast Network.